Hi, this is Craig Smith from the Alhambra Theater. You're listening to my good friend Scott Grant on 103.9 WSOS.
Hey, Scott Grant here, and my guest today is Scott Schilbrack. And Scott played football for Florida State University, and I know there's a lot of Seminole fans out there and a lot of Seminole haters. But you played for the legendary Bobby Bowden. Is that correct, Scott?
That's correct, Scott. Came into my living room in 1986 and recruited me, met my parents, told me Florida State was going to be the place for me, and I went up there and checked it out, and boy, am I glad he did.
Now, where were you when he came into your living room, met your parents?
I was living in Lauderhill, Florida, a small suburb outside of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and one interesting thing about Bobby Bowden is I saw him at a golf tournament just a few years ago, and he's always famous for remembering your parents' names and other little details about the players who played for him. And all those years later, from the mid-'80s to the early 2010s, he asked me how things were in Lauderhill. Remembered not only that I was from Fort Lauderdale, but specifically Little Lauderhill.
And did he remember your parents' names as well?
I wish I could say that he did, although we didn't get that detailed, but he did ask about him, and he asked about my family.
That's really interesting. And what year did Bowden come recruit you?
1986. I was there from 86 through 90.
Okay. And during that period, did you guys win any national championships?
You would have to ask that question, Scott. We did not, although we came close. We actually finished in the top 4 in the country 4 years in a row, which was the beginning of a 14-year streak, which no schools had ever done at that point in time, and I don't think have done since. But we finished 4th in the country once, 3rd in the country twice, and 2nd in the country once.
Wow, 2nd. How did that feel?
Kind of like kissing your sister, I guess.
That's what everybody always says, you know.
You know, it felt great. It was a huge honor, and we were very proud of our accomplishments, but you're striving so hard for a very specific goal, and you come up slightly short. It's hard not to think about what could have been.
You know, I'm known for historical stories, and one of my historical stories that I really, really like is that in 1936, a guy named Mac Robinson finishes 2nd in the 200-meter dash at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. He finishes 2nd to Jesse Owen, and nobody remembers this guy. Right, but one of his quotes is, being 2nd best in the world at something isn't that bad. It means you're better than a whole lot of people.
Right.
And that would have been true for you guys as well, right?
Absolutely. And it's funny, I guess. At the time, it's hard to fully appreciate, but over time, when you look back, you realize what an accomplishment it was to have come up 2nd or 3rd even. Yeah,
I mean, that's huge. A lot of schools out there aren't getting anywhere close to that kind of ranking. Back to Mac Robinson, another thing he says is nobody cared. You know, nobody cared. We went home, nobody cared. He actually ends up sweeping the streets of Pasadena in his Olympic sweatshirt. But the one guy that did care about his 2nd place finish was his younger brother, Jackie. And Jackie follows in his footsteps, goes to Pasadena Junior College, and then goes on to UCLA, where he's a football player, pretty good football player. And then ultimately he becomes a baseball player, and he breaks the color barrier.
Unbelievable, Scott. That is a great story that you just told. That you had that sitting on your back your back pocket, waiting to pull out and tell us about. That's a perfect story.
You're actually making me blush, but yeah, it's one of my favorites. I mean, Mac Robinson actually ran the 200 faster than anybody else in the world had ever run it that day, and Jesse Owens was a couple strides faster.
So if it weren't for Jesse Owens, he would have been a gold medal winner and a world record holder.
Exactly.
Unbelievable. Great story.
And still, again, faster than most of the rest of the world. Nobody else was going to go out there and beat Mac Robinson except for Jesse Owens.
For one person. That's awesome. That's a great story.
So we're going to come back. We're going to talk some more about your time at Florida State. And you got some great stories. You've told me some of them. A couple of them are really touching, and some of them are really funny. But right now we're going to go listen to some music, and we'll come back. We'll talk more about Florida State football.
Sounds great. Look forward to it.
You know the day destroys the night, night divides the day. Try to run, try to hide, break on through to the other side, break on through to the other side, break on through to the other side, yeah. chased our pleasures here, dug our treasures there. But can you still recall the time we cried? Bring on through to the other side. Bring on through to the other side. Come on!
Wow, you're up early. This is Scott Schilbrack, and you are listening to my good friend Scott Grant on 103.9 FM WSOS.
Hey, this is Scott Grant on WSOS 103.9 FM, and I'm here with Scott Schilbrack, who's a really good friend of mine and has some just amazing stories. You want to tell the audience, you're a big guy. Rather than me tell them, how tall are you again?
Well, I've gotten a little shorter as I've gotten older, Scott. I'm only 6'8" now.
And you were taller than this at one point?
At one point I was 6'9", and I was the tallest player to have ever played for Coach Bowden at any school.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. Remembering, Too Tall. Did they call you Too Tall at all? Remember Too Tall? Ed Jones, I think his name was, played for the Cowboys.
I've had a lot of nicknames, but I never had that one. Not exactly sure why.
Okay, so you're the tallest guy ever to play for Bowden, and you were talking about Bowden coming to your house and meeting your family, and you see these scenes in movies where the coach shows up to recruit. Is it like that in reality? I mean, do the movies do these scenes justice or not?
It's not unlike that at all. I've seen a lot of those scenes in movies from Blind Side and others. My funny story was I had a 2-year older brother who was several inches shorter than me and a good bit lighter than me, was also quite athletic but was no longer pursuing sports, and now that he'd graduated high school. And he was in our garage lifting some weights, and when Coach Bowden was leaving our house, he stopped and he saw him in there, and he greeted him and he said, "Hey, buddy, if you keep it up a couple more years, we'll be back here to recruit you then," which I think my 19-year-old brother was offended by, but it's still kind of a compliment, I guess, in its own way.
That's interesting. And was Bowden telling your parents, that he would take care of you?
He was telling them that, and he did. And people ask me a lot of times, what is he like? Back then, he used to do the commercials for Thunderbirds, and I would say, when you see him do the commercial for the Thunderbird car, how you think he would be is a lot how he is. He's a pretty down-home, genuine guy.
And a good motivator?
He's an extremely good motivator. Tell you a quick story about Coach Bowden. I had just started my first game ever at Florida State, and we were walking out to the practice fields, and I found myself, by coincidence, walking next to the head coach, and he turned to me, and I was mostly a backup offensive tackle at the time, and some of the other players used to joke that, sometimes on the spur of the moment, he wouldn't even remember your first name, and he'd call you buddy or something like that. But he called over to me, and he said, hey, buddy, and then he proceeded to explain to me how on a particular play, a 7 counter, when I was facing a wide technique, how I had improper footwork and had brought that player in to challenge me more than I should have. The player had the outside containment, and I should have given him what he wanted. But it just struck me how maybe on the spur of the moment, Coach Bowden couldn't remember my first name or when it rolled off the tip of his tongue. Probably could have told you my parents' name and my hometown. And he could also tell me exactly what was wrong with my footwork on a very specific play when facing a very specific position from the opposition.
Oh, wow. Now, one of the things I've seen you post online is a picture of you pouring Gatorade over Coach Bowden's head. Now, what game is that?
That's correct. That was actually from Coach Bowden's 200th career win, which he ended up getting a good bit over 300, but even 200 back then was a huge deal, and that was in the late 80s.
How many wins did he get altogether?
I want to say 340 by the time I was said and done.
Wow. And is that, it's not a record. The record's still held by Eddie Robinson at Grambling, right?
It depends on how you slice and dice the records. Back then, there was Division I, there was Division 1A, Division 2A, there was Division 2, there was Division 3, so that part's changed. Grambling wasn't a Division I school the way Florida State was. And then they also had to vacate some wins, and then Joe Paterno had to vacate some wins, and then some of each coaches were restored after the fact. So it's bounced back and forth. But I guess for Division I, it's Paterno and then Bowden in terms of the official record books, which I always thought vacated wins matter to everybody that wasn't on the field. If you were on the field, you played and you know who won. You looked at the scoreboard when you walked off and you were happy or sad, and that motion doesn't change when that gets vacated or restored.
Yeah, I know that Paterno had some wins vacated, and he was number one for a while, and I thought he had slipped, but maybe they gave some of those wins back. That makes sense. Like you're saying, I mean, they did win those football games, and despite some of the other stuff going on that caused them some problems. All right, we're going to come back. I know you got some good stories about when you first get to Florida State, so let's do those when we get back after a break for some music.
Sounds great.
sugar. Oh, honey, honey, you are my candy girl, and you got me wanting you. Honey, oh, sugar, sugar, you are my candy girl, and you got me wanting you. I just can't believe the loveliness of loving you. I just can't believe it's true. I just can't believe the wonder of this feeling too. I just can't believe it's true. Ah, sugar. Oh, honey, honey, you are my candy girl, and you got me wanting you. Oh, honey, oh, sugar, sugar, you are my candy girl, and you got me wanting you. When I kissed you, girl, I knew how sweet a kiss could be. I know how sweet a kiss can be. Like the summer sunshine, pour your sweetness over me. Pour your sweetness over me. Oh, sugar, sugar on me, honey. Pour your sugar on me, baby. You make life so sweet. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Pour your sugar on me. Oh, yeah. Pour your sugar on me, honey. Pour your sugar on me, baby. I'm gonna make life so sweet. Yeah, pour your sugar on me, honey. Ah, sugar. Honey, honey. You are my candy girl, and you got me wanting you. Oh, honey, honey, sugar, sugar, honey, sugar, you are my candy
Hi, this is Jeremiah Blocker. I'm a resident of Ponte Vedra in Nocatee, Florida, and you're listening to the Scott Grant Show on 103.9 FM, WSOS, St. Augustine, America's oldest city.
Hey, this is Scott Grant, and I'm here with Scott Schilbrack, my good friend and former Florida State offensive lineman under Bobby Bowden, the legendary football coach. Now, Scott, you've told me this story before about when you first get to college, and you're tall and a bit skinny, I guess, for your height at least. How big were you when you get there?
That's correct, Scott. I got to Florida State. I measured 6'8" and 255 pounds, which is pretty slim, especially for an offensive lineman. I did end up growing 1 inch when I was in college, but they also wanted me to put on weight pretty quickly, which is a good problem to have. At this stage in my life, I wish somebody would come to me and say, we want you to eat anything you can want and try to put on 30 or 40 or 50 pounds in these next couple of years, but those days are behind me.
I think it would be easy for you now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I could put on 30 pounds in a hurry. Just eat pizza all the time and French fries.
Yeah, I wish I still had that problem. But back then, I was literally eating about 10,000 calories a day.
Wow.
I was exercising quite a bit too, so I was burning off those calories. But when I first got to Florida State, I remember my coach really wanted me to put on weight, important for that position, and he put me on something called the brown bag plan, and I wasn't sure what it was. And some of the other players that were older than me snickered a little bit that I was getting on the brown bag plan. And what that meant was that every night at the end of all of my day of school and class and practice and then film afterwards and meetings, sometimes it'd be 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, and before I would go home, I would walk through the closed up training table, and there was a tray with brown bags with each player's name on it. And I would grab the one that said Scott S., and I would take it up to my room, and it almost always had the same things in it. It would have a meat sandwich, it would have a piece of fruit, usually a banana or an apple, something like that, and 2 big giant chocolate chip cookies with peanut butter in between them, smeared together to make a big sandwich, and I would eat those things every night before I would go to bed.
I mean, nowadays they have really, complex, doctor-driven training regimens and feeding, right? I mean, this doesn't sound like that to me. This sounds a little more antiquated. Brown bag with a sandwich and two chocolate chip cookies with like an ice cream sandwich, but
That's
with
right.
the peanut butter in between.
That's right. 2 chocolate chip cookies with peanut butter in between them. And the 80s, for some of us, doesn't sound like that long ago, but in many respects it was, compared to how, culinary science and dietary science has changed and things like that. I mean, we were pretty sophisticated and pretty cutting edge as a major college football program back then, but that meant more, eating carbs if there's not a lot of time between the meal and the game, and eating steak or protein if there was a longer period of time between eating the pregame meal and the game, whatever it was. Nowadays, it's literally a science.
And I imagine it is. Well, I mean, there's some science there. Bananas are good. Meat sandwich is good. Putting on some weight's good. So how much weight did you gain?
About 40 pounds.
Oh, so you got up over 300?
No, I never did. And some of my friends joke with me these days that I was a biscuit shy of 300 for years. I played in between 296 and 299 for years and just could not get over the top, which by today's standards is small. It's way too skinny to play offensive line in modern college football.
Well, these guys have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger over the years. And you think about, like, how good are you at the history of football?
Not very. I've had people keep me on the end of my seat describing games that I played in.
Oh, wow.
That's a true story.
So you don't remember the game as well as they do from maybe watching it or from studying the press on it or that kind of thing?
I don't. And I know a lot of players that say the same thing. You're so caught up in relatively small details of the game, and you're watching, the down and distance and the scoreboard and things like that, of course, but you're much more caught up in maybe different techniques that your defender is using that you're going to have to think through and counteract and be prepared for him to set you up with this and then come back with that and that type of thing. I never like to compare football with war too much, but I wonder if sometimes the people who are actually fighting in a war could come close to describing the historical accuracies of a particular battle near as well as any given historian, let alone you, Scott.
Hey, no, that's a good point. I never thought of it. Well, and I guess I have thought about football in terms of war because there's some similarities. George Carlin jokes and stuff. Everybody talks about the wording, the language is similar. Between war and football. But yeah, I think if you're in the trenches in World War I, you probably don't have much of an idea of what's going on other than you're hunkering down and hoping you don't die.
That's probably right. And although most of us were pretty sure we weren't going to die, sometimes you were thinking about nothing more than hunkering down and making sure you don't get beat to the inside by a defensive end that wants to tattoo his forehead into your quarterback's chest.
Yeah. All right. Jennifer's telling us we need to take a break. We're going to go play some music and come back and talk some more with Scott Schilbrack.
Thanks. Look forward to it.
ABC, easy as 1, 2, 3.
Was only true in fairy tales, and for someone else, but not for me. Our love was out to get me. That's the way it seemed. Disappointment haunted all my dreams. Then I saw her face. Now I'm a believer. Not a trace of doubt in my mind. I'm in love. I'm a believer. I couldn't leave her if I tried. I thought love was more or less a given thing. Seems the more I gave, the less I got. What's the use in trying? All you get is pain. When I needed sunshine, I got rain. Oh, then I saw her face. Now I'm a believer. Not a trace of doubt in my mind. I'm in love. I'm a believer. I couldn't leave her if I tried. That's the way it seemed. Disappointment haunted all my dreams. Oh, then I saw her face. Now I'm a believer. Not a trace of doubt in my mind. I'm in love. I'm a believer. I couldn't leave her if I tried. Yes, I saw her face. Now I'm a believer. I'm not a trace of doubt in my mind. Said I'm a believer, yeah, 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 yeah. Said I'm a believer, yeah, I'm a believer. Said I'm a believer, yeah, I'm a believer.
Hi, Scott Grant here, and I am with Scott Schilbrack, a good friend of mine. He's been telling us some fascinating football stories. Now, in the break, you were telling me you played with Deion Sanders, Neon Deion Sanders. Is that right?
That's correct. That was when Neon Dion was not even prime time yet.
I periodically look at lists of the greatest athletes to come out of the state of Florida. And Deion is usually number one or number two. Vince Carter gets mentioned pretty highly as well. Bob Hayes, who's from Jacksonville, and my personal favorite, usually much further down the list.
Bullet Bob Hayes, right?
Yeah, Bullet Bob Hayes, world's fastest man. So what do you think? Deion's greatest?
Deion is the greatest I ever played with, that's for sure. You can't always tell greatness at an early age. Deion was 1 year ahead of me, so when I got there in 1986, he was starting his sophomore year, and he was already well established as the best return specialist in the country and arguably the best defensive back in the country as a sophomore.
That's fascinating, and it's great that you played with him. Now let's talk about some big games that you played in. Give me a game that you remember from the days of Florida State that was particularly in your memory as a great moment in your career.
Sure. We had a couple great years. Obviously, '87 was sort of the beginning of our having 10-plus wins and finishing in the top 4 each year, so that was a huge accomplishment for us. 1988 was arguably even a better year for us in that we went on the road and beat Michigan State when they were great, Auburn when they were great, and everybody else on our schedule, including the University of Florida Gators. So that really put us on the map. We went to the Fiesta Bowl and played against Nebraska, which at the time I remember one of my teammates making the comment that he felt like we were playing against our dads because the guys were all huge and had beards, and it seemed like they were 30-year-olds to us. But we did walk away with a W by the time all was said and done. We finished number 2 in the country behind the national championship Miami Hurricanes.
Oh, so Miami was number 1. That had to hurt a little bit coming from that part of the country, right?
Yeah, that did hurt a lot coming from that part of the country, and we had quite a rivalry with Miami. My 5 years there, we lost to them 4 of the 5 times, and their teams went on to win a couple national championships, and their players went on, many of them, to be not only NFL stars, but NFL
legends.
Hall of Famers.
Hall of Famers. They had some good players. Michael Irvin was on some of those teams, is that right?
Michael Irvin was on some of those teams, catching balls from Vinny Testaverde. Quick story about Michael Irvin is when I was a freshman in high school at St. Thomas Aquinas High School, I was playing 3 sports, and Michael Irvin saw me one day and called me over and said, I still remember we were standing right next to the bike rack where everybody locked up their bikes. And he asked me how old I was. And I told him how old I was. And he said, you're in the 9th grade? And I said, yeah. And he said, and you're supposed to be in the 9th grade? And I said, I'm supposed to be in the 9th grade. Yeah, I think at the time I was about 6'3", maybe 210, 215 or so. And he was probably the first person who told me this. But he said, if you stick with it and you play all these sports and you stick with it and work hard at them through high school, you'll get to go to any college you want in the country. I didn't quite get to go to any college I wanted in the country, though I probably would have picked Florida State anyway. But he did give me some words of advice very early on that stuck with me and really resonated.
That's great. That's a really great story. And what a legend. Do you ever talk to him? Have you ever gone up to him and said, hey, you said something nice to me when I was in 9th grade and it inspired me in life and sports?
I haven't, but, he's a Hurricane, so.
Oh, yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. I would love to have the opportunity to say that to him. I enjoyed watching him play for years.
And so you say you played 3 sports. I'm presuming one of those sports was basketball.
One of them was basketball. One of them was football. And for most of my years in high school, I was on the track and field team throwing the shot put and the discus.
And you would have had a lot of leverage in both of those, the shot put and the discus.
I did well at both, but I was never great at either. It was sports that I really picked up in high school, and it kind of kept me going to practice year-round, which is really what I was looking to do.
And were you a good basketball player?
I was an okay basketball player. I used to joke that the earth loved me too much to let me jump very far away from it.
Well, that's a problem a lot of people have. That is a problem a lot of people have. But 6'8", 6'9". I'm a little surprised that you didn't get recruited to play basketball someplace, that somebody didn't say, hey. But you were in Florida. Florida's a football state, not a basketball state historically. So every kid grows up wanting to play football, correct?
Correct. I love both sports and still do love both sports, but I was definitely a better football player than I was basketball.
All right, listen, let's take another break. We'll listen to some songs, and we will come back, and we'll talk some more about football and what you're doing now.
That sounds great.
It's been a hard day's night, and I've been working like a dog. It's been a hard day's night, I should be sleeping like a log. But when I get home to you, I find the things that you do make me feel alright. Oh, I work all day to get you money to buy a
you want to know what's going on in Northeast Florida, Jacksonville, and St. Augustine yesterday, today, and tomorrow, tune in to Scott Grant at 103.9. He's got all the latest and the best history we've got.
Hi, Scott Grant here. I'm with Scott Schilbrack, and Jennifer Price is in the studio with us, and she's suffering from a little stage fright, so we're going to give her an opportunity to ask a question now.
Okay. Who was your nutritionist making you those chocolate chip cookie and peanut butter sandwiches?
Jennifer, I know we did not have a nutritionist. I'm not even sure that the term existed back then.
So it was probably your coach.
Yeah, I think it was pretty much the coach deciding some peanut butter would fatten me up quick.
And there's a lot of protein in peanut butter. Does it have carbs as well? I don't know.
I watch my carbs a lot closer now than I did back then. And that's the but there's not a lot of carbs in peanut butter. Peanut butter is okay for a low-carb diet in moderation.
And you had to be pretty disciplined with all the partying going on as well.
Yeah, you did. You did. And if you weren't disciplined enough, they would put some discipline in place for you. We used to have a thing back then in the late 80s. It was casually nicknamed the Breakfast Club. That meant if you missed your curfew, which on most weeknights was 11 o'clock, if you weren't back in the football dorms by 11 o'clock, you would get assigned to one morning of the Breakfast Club, which meant you had to show up at 5 a.m. at the stadium and go from the bottom of the stadium up the 82 rows, which was 164 steps. You had to go up to the top, touch the top fence, and then come back down and do it 10 times.
No matter how bad you were feeling.
No matter how bad you were feeling.
Oh, did you ever have to suffer that?
Yeah, I had to suffer it more than once or twice or even a couple dozen times.
You know, when the Jaguars were in London a couple years ago, they were out really, really late. And I remember calling you and asking you. Remember me calling you and going, Scott, I got a question for you. Did you guys have a curfew? And I think one of the things you said to me was, yeah, we did, but I was in college, remember? I mean, it's different, right? Right? Isn't that what you said?
Yeah, well, you'd always do your best to make curfew, and you wanted to try to make curfew, and I almost always did make curfew, and I took my responsibilities seriously. But we were also college students, and it was not impossible for us to miss curfew once or twice. I still have a few friends who razzed me about the time that I had made curfew, but then I was out later and ran into a graduate assistant at the same bar that I was, and I was kind of frustrated because the next day I had to go see my position coach, and he assigned me to do 10 stadiums the following morning for going out after curfew, and then he assigned me 10 more for not going home after I had run into the graduate assistant, but staying at the bar. But I kind of figured the horses were out of the stable at that point, so it didn't seem fair that I had to get double duty.
Yeah, I can understand that, particularly at that age. You think, well, I've been caught. I got my ticket, right? And I can speed all I want for the rest of the night. Tell us a story about just something that sticks in your mind. And in the break, you were talking about the Ruski play. Is that what it's called, the Ruski?
Sure. And I've never seen Jennifer Price have any kind of stage fright, but I got from the look that she was giving me while I was using that term that she had no idea.
I've never heard of that term before. This is sports we're talking about.
This is sports we're talking about. This is football. There was a very famous play known as the punt Ruski, and a Ruski is sort of a trick play within a trick play. The punt Ruski against Clemson was a very famous play where we were trailing late in the fourth quarter. We had taken a lead, trying to upset number 5 ranked Clemson, number 4 or 5th ranked Clemson in Death Valley, which was hard to do, and we were not expected to win. We had taken lead, but they had taken it back, and it was late in the fourth quarter. We called a trick play. Coach Bowden called a trick play deep in our territory, which was a very, very gutsy thing to do. He was known as the Riverboat Gambler at the time, and for very good reason. And if you want to Google the play, it's a great play to watch because the ball actually gets hiked from the center to the upback, whose job it is to stand and block for the punter. The punter has to jump up and do a good acting role and pretend the ball is flying over his head, panic, turn around and run backwards to chase the ball into the end zone, to lure the defenders to chase him into the end zone, thereby running past the upback. The upback was Leroy Butler, who took that ball and ran as fast as he could, but did get run down from behind within the 10-yard line. I think he got to the 6 or 7 yard line, and the very next play myself and the rest of the extra point and field goal team came out, kicked the ball through the uprights. We took the lead and ended up winning the game and upsetting Clemson on the road. It was one of the biggest wins at the time in Florida State history.
Wow. You like that story,
That
Jennifer?
was, it held my attention. I liked that.
Oh, you kept Jennifer Price's attention on a football story. I got to tell you, that's hard to do.
I see her Googling this story later. She's going to be watching it on YouTube.
And then you said it was Butler, Leroy Butler?
That's right. Leroy Butler, phenomenal player, great guy, ended up becoming one of the greatest Green Bay Packers in history.
All right. And was he also a Florida boy, or was he from someplace else? Do you remember?
Not only a Florida boy, a Jacksonville native.
Oh, he's from Jacksonville.
Woo-woo.
Is he the greatest football player ever to come out of Jacksonville?
I don't know. That's an arguable point. He's certainly one of them, but Jacksonville has produced some amazing football players.
You know who I vote for? Bob Hayes.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised.
All right, we'll come back after we'll listen to some music, come back. We'll talk to you about what you're doing now.
Perfect.
Hi, this is Lenny Foster, St. Augustine photographer, and you're listening to The Scott Grant Show on 103.9 St. Augustine Radio.
Don't know much about history. Don't know much biology. Don't know much about a science book. Don't know much about the French I took. But I do know that I love you. And I know that if you love me too, what a wonderful world this would be. Don't know much about geography. Don't know much trigonometry. Don't know much about algebra. Don't know what a sliding rule is for. But I do know 1 and 1 is 2. And if this one could be with you, what a wonderful world this would be. Now, I don't claim to be an A student, but I'm trying to be. For maybe by being an A student, baby, I can win your love for me. Don't know much about history. Don't know much biology. Don't know much about a science book. Don't know much about the French I took. But I do know that I love you. And I know that if you love me too, what a wonderful world this would be. La ta 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 ta. History. Biology. Well, la ta 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 ta. French I took. Yeah, but I do know that I love you. And I know that if you love me too, what a wonderful world this would be.
Stars shining bright above you. Night breezes seem to whisper, I love you. Birds singing in the sycamore tree. Dream a little dream of me. Say nighty night and kiss me. Just hold me tight and tell me you'll miss me while I'm alone and blue as can be. Dream a little dream of me. Stars fading, but I linger on, dear. Still craving your kiss. I'm longing to linger till dawn, dear. Just saying this. Sweet dreams till sunbeams find you. Sweet dreams that leave all worries behind you. But in your dreams, whatever they be, dream a little dream of of me. Stars fading, but I linger on, dear, still craving your kiss. I'm longing to linger till dawn, dear, just saying this. Sweet dreams till sunbeams find you. Sweet dreams that leave all worries far behind you. But in your dreams, whatever they be, dream a little dream of me. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da.
Wow, you're up early. This is Scott Schilbrack, and you are listening to my good friend Scott Grant on 103.9 FM WSOS.
Hi, Scott Grant here. I'm with Scott Schilbrack. And we've been talking about Florida State, and I wanted to give you a chance to talk about what you're doing right now, but we haven't mentioned Julie, your wife, who's delightful and smart, really smart woman. And you guys met at Florida State, is that correct?
That's correct. We met at Florida State. It's cliche, I guess, but she was a cheerleader and I was a football player.
And did you meet on the field?
I have a couple versions of that story. I like to tell about the time that there was a batted ball that flew through the air, and I had to catch it with my left hand just as I slid out of bounds and crashed into the pyramid of cheerleaders, the top of which fell off the top. And I stood up just to catch her in my left hand before I could spike the football with my right hand. But that story's all made up. The truth is we just met going to practice one day and got to know each other a little bit better.
Oh, we ladies, we like the truth.
I know, but it's a much better story than the reality. But I am still smitten with her, that's for sure.
Oh, I can tell. And she's great. I adore her. You said you noticed her doing acrobatics once. Tell us that story, too.
Well, she was the head cheerleader, and she was the first cheerleader to come out of the tunnel when the players would run onto the field. And she was the one that would do the back handsprings, and she could do them for a good 50 or so yards. And although we didn't start dating for a few years and didn't get engaged and married for a few years after that, I remember watching her and thinking, now that's marriage material.
For the handsprings, huh?
That's a way to get a guy's attention.
It certainly was.
And now there's sort of an image of cheerleaders being a little bit vapid and doing handsprings, but Julie's a genius, right? I mean, Julie's she has some graduate degrees, as I recall.
Julie is a genius. Julie is one of the smartest people I know. She does have a law degree. Though she does not practice law, she works with us at Luton Insurance. But it might be surprising for some people to learn, more cheerleaders than not that I know were very academically successful and motivated and were quite bright.
Well, I think it's true for athletes as well, and I think it's true for cheerleaders, and I think it's true. They're used to being disciplined, they're used to succeeding, and they're driven. And I think that's true both you and your wife.
I think that's very true, and I think it's benefited us in our careers as well. I think sports teaches a lot of life's harder lessons to teach, and it makes it almost seem easy. It teaches you how to keep your eyes on a prize of a long-term goal and take small incremental steps today that are going to get you closer and closer to that goal that might otherwise be hard to visualize. And I think it also, especially team sports, teaches you the importance of worrying less about yourself and worrying more about making sure the goal is accomplished by whatever means necessary, especially as an offensive lineman. Nobody knows our name. They used to joke that nobody would even know your name at the end of a game unless you did something bad. They only said your name when you jumped off sides or got a holding call. But at the same time, my team gets the same number of points if I score the touchdown or if somebody else does.
Well, an offensive lineman is a little like center in basketball. I mean, there's a lot of footwork and there's a lot of technique that you have to learn in order to play that position. Is that correct?
That's exactly right, Scott. It's very technique-oriented, and I watch football different than a lot of people do as a result. Sometimes I don't even follow what's going on with the ball or the ball carrier because I'm trying to watch how an offensive tackle deals with a really fast outside rush guy and what kind of steps he takes. And a lot of times the first or second step will tell the end of the story even before it gets there because his first step's out of place. He's never going to catch up.
Did you ever take any dance lessons?
I might have had a better career if I had. That's probably a good idea. Where were you when I needed you, Jennifer?
Oh, there's a lot of great places in town.
There are, yeah. We talk about dance lessons all the time, and my son's been taking them with out at Monarch with Krista Thomas, and he seems to really like it. And I think it's helped him. I think it's helped him with a bunch of parts of his life.
I need to sign my 12-year-old up.
Nice. I can remember when I was in college, they were talking about Lynn Swan, and they made fun of him even because the word got out that he was taking ballet lessons, but he's in the Hall of Fame now, so I think he gets the last laugh.
Well, that's an appropriate name.
That's true. I never thought of it like that, Jennifer.
Swan Lake, is that what you're thinking? Lynn Swan was a great one.
It's
No
a
question.
graceful name.
No question about it. Lynn Swan was a great one. So nowadays you have an insurance company and you do property and casualty insurance.
That's correct, Scott. My family and I, we started the Luton Insurance Agency in 2010. We're a full-service, independent property and casualty agency. Full service means we take care of all of your customer service needs, from writing the policy to making any adjustments to the policy down the line, and even holding your hand as you go through the claims process, if necessary. Hope you never need that part of our services, but we do make sure it goes smoothly when it does. And
you've had to use that service, right? You've gotten flooded out a couple times.
That's true. Never wanted to learn that aspect of the business. I got to admit, from that perspective anyway, but learning about making a claim, especially a flood claim from a book and from teachers, and applying it even towards going through the claims process with my policyholders was very different than living it. In Hurricane Matthew, we had 6 figures worth of damage to our home, and we were out of the home for a few months. The home wasn't fully restored for really a matter of years. But they literally replaced my roof and my ceiling and my siding and my stucco and my windows and my carpet and my flooring and my cabinets. And
Sounds
my
like they
bathrooms.
rebuilt the house around you.
They pretty much did. It's the same wood framing in the walls, but not much else is. And going through it firsthand is a lot different than learning about it from a book.
And we're running out of time, but let me kind of end with this question. How did football prepare you for life?
You know, that's a great question, Scott. And you never know how you'd be if you hadn't done the things that you did. So in that way, it's hard for me to answer. But at the same time, I look around some of my peers, and well, I'll put it this way. When I first got into being a sales professional, one of my early managers said to me, if you will always try and tell the truth, return phone calls in a timely manner, and do the things you tell people you're going to do for them, you'll be in the top 10% of people in your profession. Someone else told me that later on about when I got more specifically into insurance, became an insurance agent, and had my own insurance agency.
Oh, no, that's great. And I think, the idea of carrying through, I mean, that comes from sports, right? I mean, when everybody else is in college, they're going to parties, sleeping in, missing classes, but you're not doing that.
That's right. That's exactly right.
You got to show up.
You got to show up. You got to be on time. 10:59's late if you're supposed to be somewhere by 11. And you have to kind of, work the process from the very beginning. And I think football really did that for me. When both of those managers told me that story, I thought, well, that sounds pretty easy. But it's not just about doing it. It's about doing it consistently, doing it over time, doing it with passion, really putting your heart into it and giving your best effort, and knowing yourself well enough to know when you're not giving your best effort, and challenging yourself to step up and make sure that you are.
I like that line about challenging yourself.
I think that's the best part about Scott Schilbrack is his passion.
Oh, I agree. I agree.
He's a
no
passionate
question.
networker.
He is. We're way over time for this segment, so let's go. We'll be back next week. Scott, I'd love to have you come back again and talk some more.
It'd be my pleasure. I appreciate it.
If you want to know what's going on in Northeast Florida, Jacksonville, and St. Augustine yesterday, today, and tomorrow, tune in to Scott Grant at 103.9. He's got all the latest and the best history we've got.